Hi there. I am Liangyu Chen, now presenting our paper, Making Your First Choice, to address cold start problem in medical active learning. Active learning is a learning paradigm to select important samples for annotation. Massive medical images are generated every day. With limited budget and time, it is infeasible to annotate each and every clinical image that we have. So we try to find an important subset of images for human expert to annotate. The common approach is called human-in-the-loop active learning procedure. It incorporates both human experts and a machine model together to precisely detect the disease. Assume we have a small set of labeled images, we first train a model with it and test the model on the unlabeled images and get the predictions. Based on the predictions, we query the most important images from unlabeled images and send them to human experts for annotation. Then merge the newly annotated data with the current labeled set. By using these data to fine-tune the model, we get the predictions from the new model. Then we select the most important images again for annotation. As you see, it is a loop. In each cycle of the loop, we select the most important images batch by batch. Therefore, active learning ideally reduces annotation cost compared to random selection to achieve a certain performance. But how do we start this loop? At the very beginning, we need to select some images to annotate, which we call the initial query. No matter what active learning method we use for annotation, our initial query is generally randomly selected. This is because in active learning, the model judges which images are most important. But when we select the initial query, there is no model yet. That's why the first points are overlapped for both the cases of random selection and active sampling. The prior arts tried several intelligent methods, but they perform worse than random sampling. This is the cold start problem in active learning. In this work, we systematically analyze the cold start problem and then propose a method to select a better initial query. We find that if we can intelligently choose a relatively good initial query, the entire active learning process will be affected. The value of studying the cold start problem is that a better initial query can not only significantly improve annotation efficiency when annotation costs are low, but also improve the effect of active learning. We want to intelligently select an initial query. Can existing active learning methods work? In our experiments, we benchmarked 6 promising active learning methods. We covered uncertainty sampling, diversity sampling, and hybrid methods. Our experimental results are shown in the figure on the left. The x-axis of this figure is the number of labeled samples, and the y-axis is the performance of a classification model, measured by AUC score. We found that when the number of labeled samples is relatively small, using the shown 6 existing active learning methods to select the initial query performs worse than random selection. The x-axis of this figure is the initial query, for example, selecting 100 or 1000 images at once using entropy. Existing literature also proves that active sampling underperforms random sampling in selecting initial queries. In 2020, Chandra et al. First attempted to find an initial query that outperforms random sampling in active learning, but they failed. Poramat et al. Found that a simple k-means clustering algorithm can outperform state-of-the-art active learning methods with a small initial query. They learned meaningful representations for a dataset using a self-supervised learning method, then clustered on these representations, and selected the cluster centers together as the initial query. This selection method ensures the diversity of the samples. K-means gives us the insight that diversity is very important. Another paper also found that actively selecting the initial query sometimes performs better than random selection, and sometimes worse. But whether it is better or worse, the difference is only temporary. After a few rounds, this difference disappears. In the end, the initial query has almost no impact on the final active learning results. To summarize, both previous works and our benchmark experiments show that so far there is no way to select an initial query that consistently outperforms random sampling. Now, we have gained an intuitive understanding of the cold start problem. What are the causes of cold start problem? We conduct systematic analysis in our paper. We discuss the cold start problem in active learning from 2 aspects. First, I will talk about the interclass factor between different categories. We hypothesize that the reason existing active learning methods cannot select a good initial query is that they have bias between categories, causing the model to not see enough samples from certain classes. If we can ensure label diversity, which is learning some samples from each class, the selected initial query should be very favorable for model performance. In this figure, the left side shows medical image classification. Each column is a method for selecting the initial query, including random selection, the 6 active learning baselines we mentioned, and our proposed method called Hakan. The leftmost is random, whose selected class distribution represents the overall dataset distribution. We can see that some methods, like margin and entropy, have very large biases when selecting samples. For example, they select more muscle and fewer background and mucus. Considering the overall labeling cost is relatively low, the neglected background and mucus classes will not be easily learned by the model. Some active methods' selected initial queries are closer to the original data distribution, such as consistency and bald. To measure if an initial query has bias between classes, I used the simple metric of entropy to calculate whether a query has uniform sampling across classes. Higher entropy means the classes are more evenly distributed in the query. Among all initial query selection methods, random has the highest entropy, which means it is the most uniform distribution. The second highest is our proposed Hakan, which has less bias than all the existing active learning methods. Since we hypothesize label diversity is a good property, but existing active learning methods do not have label diversity, what if we just add label diversity to current active learning methods? We did a simple benchmark experiment to verify this conjecture. We first forcibly conduct uniform sampling. We select the same number of samples from each class, then use strategies like random or consistency to pick samples within each class. The experimental results are in the rows with the uniform column checked. The rows in the uniform column with a cross are without forced uniform sampling, using only active learning metrics to select samples. When adding uniform sampling performs better than not adding it, I marked it in blue. We found that on 3 different modalities of medical image datasets, most of the time adding uniform sampling is better than sole active learning, sometimes showing a significant gap. This shows that label uniformity can significantly improve active learning methods' performance in selecting the initial query. Again, label uniformity refers to whether the selection of samples from each class is evenly distributed in the query. We hypothesize label uniformity is a good indicator. This argument is supported by Poramod et al. 2020. The authors claimed uniform methods generally outperform non-uniform methods. When selecting the initial query, even a simple k-means technique can outperform recent active learning methods because it tends to select a more uniform distribution. But in the real world, label uniformity is not easy to achieve because if we use current active learning methods, we tend to introduce bias among categories. Also, if we simply use random sampling, we cannot achieve uniform sampling if the dataset itself is imbalanced. Some classes will be underrepresented. This illustration shows an unbalanced dataset. Head classes contain more samples, and tail classes contain much fewer. If using random sampling, head classes will be sampled in larger quantities, while tail classes will only get a few samples. So the uniform sampling shown in this figure is a better selection approach than random. Following the uniform distribution, how do we sample from within each class? Next, we will discuss the other aspect of the cold start problem, the intraclass factor, which refers to the metrics for selecting samples within a class. How can we quantify data samples? We introduce a simple data map to split data into 3 folds: hard to learn, ambiguous, easy to learn. Each point on this figure represents one sample. The y-axis is a sample's confidence. Confidence measures whether a model can give the correct answer a relatively high prediction probability during training. For example, in a binary classification task of healthy or unhealthy, after the model trains on a specific sample for 200 epochs, assuming the ground truth of this sample is unhealthy, then each epoch will make a prediction for this sample. So for this model, the confidence of this specific sample is the average of the 200 prediction probabilities for the unhealthy class. Clearly, the higher the confidence value, the easier the sample is for the model to learn. It is an easy-to-learn sample. Conversely, if the sample confidence is very low, it is hard to learn, and the model cannot learn it no matter what. The authors of this data map found that hard-to-learn samples generally have label errors, meaning wrong annotations. So they cannot be learned no matter what. The x-axis is the average variability, the spread of those values. In summary, the real beauty of this data map is that it intuitively paints a picture of the difficulty of a sample, what can be easily learned by the model, and what cannot. We can quantify the properties of samples using the data map. To avoid the ground truth labels needed for plotting data maps, we use self-supervised learning to generate pseudo-labels. In this paper, we use contrastive learning. Going back to our data map, previously under supervised learning we used the prediction values of the correct answers to calculate confidence. Now we make a small change, we take the positive samples from contrastive learning as the correct answers, even though they are pseudo-labels, we can still calculate confidence. We now have two methods to plot the data map on a dataset. On the left is the supervised learning, using ground truth label predictions to calculate confidence and variability. We call high confidence samples here easy to learn. On the right is self-supervised learning, using pseudo-label predictions to calculate confidence and variability. For this case, we call high confidence samples as easy to contrast, since they are easy samples to contrast and distinguish in contrastive learning. The data maps plotted with ground truth and pseudo-labels have different shapes. Hard to learn and hard to contrast pick samples with different characteristics, positioned differently on the data map. Hard to contrast samples are difficult to contrast with other samples in contrastive learning, especially hard to distinguish from samples of the same class. So we can consider hard to contrast samples to represent the most typical part of each class. Bar plots show that hard to contrast performs the best on both medical and natural images, outperforming easy to learn, easy to contrast, and hard to learn. Why does hard to contrast work better than easy to contrast? We visualize three datasets with UMAP. Dot color indicates class. We marked the samples selected by easy to contrast and hard to contrast, denoted by crosses. We found easy to contrast tends to select some outliers, like picking a red point in the middle of a cluster of blue points. In contrast, hard to contrast does select more typical samples, reducing outlier queries. Let's recap. We found two key factors for selecting a good initial query to address the cold start problem. First, interclass factor. We hypothesize label uniformity is important. Second, intraclass factor. We compared selection criteria within each class and found hard to contrast, or the most typical samples work best. We did some preliminary experiments that also verified our hypotheses. If the label uniformity of active learning is high, and the queried samples cover all classes evenly, the results are better. Within each class, selecting the most typical and representative samples works better than picking particularly hard samples. Based on the findings above, we propose an effective method to select the initial query for active learning. Our method is called HACON, named after the hard to contrast metric. First, we apply contrastive pre-training to gain representations and pseudo-labels. Second, we plot a data map by pseudo-labels. Third, we cluster image features and then uniformly select samples from each cluster for label uniformity. Within each cluster, we query the most typical images, also known as hard to contrast data. The final output of this pipeline is the initial query for active learning. We conducted experiments on 5 natural and medical image datasets. The x-axis shows the number of labeled images, starting with a 20-image initial query, querying 10 more each time, until 50 images. The y-axis shows model performance in AUC. We found that our proposed HACON outperforms random selection and existing active learning methods on these datasets. Additionally, we discovered a strong correlation between start and end performance during active learning. This shows a good initial query improves performance throughout, highlighting the importance of initial query selection. In this work, we illustrate the cold start problem in vision active learning. We discovered that biased query and outlier query are the underlying causes of the cold start problem. We find that hard to contrast data can solve the cold start problem. We use data map and self-supervised learning to select hard to contrast data as the initial query. This work serves as a simple yet strong baseline to sample the initial query for the human-in-the-loop active learning procedure. Read our paper for more details. Thank you for your interest in our work.